The year is 1064. Beneath the burning skies of the Holy Land, where the desert wind carries the taste of dust and iron, a story is about to be carved into history with steel and blood. From the cold, mist-covered coasts of the north came 800 warriors, not common soldiers, but men shaped by winters that broke weaker men, seas that devoured entire fleets, and endless wars that forged their bones into iron. They were the last breath of the old Norse rage, fused now with a new and frightening purpose, holy conviction. And standing against them was a force so vast it seemed to stretch across the horizon itself. 40,000 battle-trained enemies, armored, mounted, confident, unshaken. To the world, this was not a battle. It was a foregone conclusion, a mathematical certainty, a death sentence. But the Vikings had not come to survive. They had come to transcend. They believed that to die in battle was not loss, but ascension, a direct path to eternal glory. Their axes were prayers, their shields were scriptures, their blood was the offering. What was about to unfold was not warfare. It was faith sharpened into a blade. Our story does not begin under the burning sun of Jerusalem, but far to the north, where the sea claws at the black stone shores of Norway and the winter sky hangs low like a weight upon the earth. In those rugged lands ruled a king named Magnus III, though the world would remember him by a different name. Magnus Barefoot, a warrior king who rejected the silks, crowns, and polished sandals of European rulers. He wore rough cloaks and leather garb like the raiders of old, believing that a king should look like the men he leads. Christianity had reached Scandinavia by his time, churches had risen where pagan longhouses once stood, and the cross had been raised where the hammer of Thor had reigned. But the old fire of the north had not died, it had simply changed shape. The Viking spirit did not vanish beneath Christian robes. It merged with the new faith, forming something far more dangerous, warriors who believed their violence was divinely commanded. Magnus recognized something the other Christian rulers of Europe did not: that a soldier who fights for gold can break, a soldier who fights for a king can falter, but a soldier who believes he is fighting for God becomes something unstoppable. When word spread across Christendom that the Holy Lands were being contested, that Muslim forces controlled the sacred cities of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Pope Alexander II called upon the faithful to reclaim them. Most European princes saw this as a chance for new lands, new wealth, new titles. Magnus saw something else: the opportunity to forge a holy army of the north, an army whose faith was tempered by the brutality of Viking steel. Recruitment was not open to everyone. Magnus did not want numbers, he wanted the absolute elite. He called upon warriors who had survived the endless border wars between Norwegian chiefs, men whose hands were tattooed with scars and whose eyes had stared into the cold face of death and refused to look away. He chose only 800, and even those selected underwent trials that would have shattered ordinary soldiers. They trained for hours beyond exhaustion, forced to swing axes until their arms trembled, to march with full armor for days without rest, to fight in formation instead of the chaotic frenzy traditional Vikings were known for. Magnus was reshaping them, molding them not into raiders but into a synchronized killing machine. But the physical training was only half the transformation. Magnus brought monks, priests, and warrior chaplains who preached not peace, but holy fire. Every day began with prayer. Every night ended with confession and blessing. Their weapons were sanctified with oils and scripture. Their armor was marked with crosses. Their banners bore not the beasts of the old sagas, but the symbol of the crucified Christ. Yet beneath the cross beat the same relentless Viking heartbeat, the belief that a glorious death was the highest honor a man could achieve. Only now that glory was tied not to Valhalla, but to the heaven of the Church. This fusion produced something the medieval world had rarely seen: fanatics who were disciplined, berserkers who could think, holy warriors who did not fear death because they saw it as the completion of their purpose. To these men, the battlefield was not merely a place of survival, it was an altar. And when these 800 stood together, they were not a warband. They were a crusade in human form, marching not for conquest, but to fulfill what they believed was a divine prophecy, that God Himself had chosen them to reclaim the Holy Land. They were not going to Jerusalem to return home. They were going there to become immortal. When spring returned and the ice finally loosened its grip on the northern seas, The fleet of Magnus barefoot prepared to leave the fjords of Bergen. But Magnus was no fool, and he understood what many kings throughout history failed to grasp. No army, no matter how skilled, should enter a distant war without preparation, experience, and allies. He did not intend to throw his warriors directly into the blazing heart of the Holy Land without first sharpening them against the world. Their journey would not be a march of haste, it would be a pilgrimage of transformation. And so, the fleet set sail not toward Jerusalem, but first to the Orkney Islands, where the harsh winds howled over stone monasteries and rugged coasts. There, Magnus recruited local mercenaries, accustomed to battling in climates harsher and more unpredictable than Europe's farms and fields. These men were survivors, and they were about to learn what it meant to fight alongside Vikings whose faith burned with the intensity of wildfire. From Orkney, the fleet turned south, riding the currents along the coast of Spain. Here, the Crusaders faced their first true tests, skirmishing with Muslim raiders and Saracen warbands who defended the shores with surprising mobility and precision. For the Vikings, these were not typical enemies like Saxon shield walls or Norse raiders of the north. These were warriors who fought from horseback, who relied on speed rather than brute force, whose arrows came not in volleys but in surgical storms designed to break formations and scatter infantry. The Northmen learned quickly that strength alone meant little when the enemy moved like smoke. Instead, they adapted. Their shields formed tighter circles. Their counterattacks grew timed and measured. Their formations began to breathe like living organisms that could expand and contract under pressure. The Vikings were learning to fight as one body, each man a limb of a greater war machine. But it was in Constantinople, jewel of the Byzantine world, that the transformation reached its climax. The city's golden domes rose like suns above the sea, its walls bearing scars from centuries of war, its marketplaces filled with mercenaries from every corner of the known world. Armenians, Varangians, Greeks, Franks, and desert warriors who spoke languages unknown in the north. Here, Magnus's warriors trained under Byzantine commanders who had perfected the art of organized warfare. They learned techniques the Norse had never practiced: how to maintain a formation under continuous barrage, how to break cavalry charges with angular shield placement, how to deploy fire as a weapon rather than a danger. And most importantly, they acquired something rare and terrifying, a substance the Byzantines guarded as one of their greatest tactical secrets, a variant of Greek fire, a liquid flame that clung to armor, to flesh, to air itself, and could not be extinguished with water. This weapon did not merely kill, it devoured. By the time spring returned once more, the 800 Vikings who had left Norway were no longer simply veterans of northern wars. They were something altered, reforged, men whose bodies were honed by endless travel and battle, whose minds were sharpened by planning and discipline, and whose souls burned with certainty that their mission was sanctified by God. Their reputation spread long before they reached the Holy Land. Traders whispered of a northern holy army. Soldiers in Damascus scoffed at the thought. Commanders in Jerusalem dismissed the stories as exaggerations meant to frighten children. How could 800 men ever matter in a land guarded by armies of tens of thousands? But rumors have power, and legends move ahead of the men who create them. By the time Magnus's fleet approached the coasts near Jaffa, the Muslim commanders of the region had already prepared a response. They would not allow these northern zealots to step foot on their soil without testing the strength of their faith with the weight of overwhelming force. And so, as the Viking ships carved toward the sand, banners rose on the horizon, war horns echoed across the desert, and the earth trembled beneath the march of an army that expected not battle, but annihilation. The stage was set, the desert waited. Two worlds were about to collide, not over land, not over wealth, but over whose God would answer their screams. When the Vikings finally reached the arid plains near Jerusalem, the land itself seemed to challenge them. The sun burned with a merciless intensity. Unlike anything they had known in the north, the air was dry enough to split lips and crack skin, and heat shimmered across the ground as if the earth were made of molten glass. Yet the Vikings did not flinch. They had crossed the cold fury of the northern seas, the stone coasts of Spain, and the golden walls of Constantinople. A blazing desert was merely the final gate before destiny. But waiting for them at the edge of that wasteland was not the fated remnant of any weakened force. It was a host assembled to crush them completely. El Emir Abu Nasr Shams al-Muluke, The commander tasked with defending Jerusalem's territories had gathered an army that stretched across the horizon like a living tide. 40,000 warriors hardened by desert wars, cavalry trained to strike like lightning, archers who could loose a torrent of arrows thick enough to darken the sun, infantry who fought in layered waves, and siege engineers prepared to break any defensive position. To Abu Nasr, this was not a battle to prove courage or honor. This was a performance, a demonstration of absolute dominance meant to send a message not only to the Vikings, but to every kingdom watching from afar. If 800 warriors thought faith alone made them invincible, then the desert would become their grave. The two forces met near the ruins of an ancient fortress called Herodion, a silent witness to countless conflicts across centuries. The contrast was staggering. On one side were the Vikings, a compact square, shields raised, axes resting against their shoulders, silent and unmoving. On the other side spread the Saracen host, banners fluttering in the scorching wind, horses stamping the earth into dust, commanders issuing orders that rippled through their ranks like waves of sound. The Saracens expected fear, hesitation, even pleading for negotiations. Instead, they saw a stillness so deep that it felt unnatural, as if the Vikings were carved from stone. It was not arrogance. It was certainty. These men did not believe they fought for victory. They believed they fought for the fulfillment of a divine script already written. Abu Nasr's strategy had worked countless times before. First, his cavalry would encircle the enemy completely, cutting off escape and forcing the opposing line into a defensive posture. Next, his elite mounted archers would release volleys from a distance, weakening formations and sowing panic. Finally, once the enemy was disoriented and fragmented, his infantry would surge forward in overwhelming numbers, sweeping the battlefield with sheer weight. Against ordinary soldiers, this tactic was devastating. Against armies 10 times, even 20 times larger than the Vikings, it had proven unstoppable. There was no reason to believe that today would be different. But Magnus and his commanders had not come blindly into this confrontation. During their months of travel, they had observed, studied, and internalized the tactics of the Saracen armies. They knew the speed of their cavalry, the precision of their archers, the rhythm of their charges. They also understood something deeper, the psychological patterns that governed desert warfare. In this landscape, fear spread faster than flame, and morale was a currency more valuable than armor or numbers. The Vikings did not intend to resist the Saracen attack. They intended to warp the very perception of the battlefield, to make the enemy believe the impossible was unfolding before their eyes. As dawn bled slowly across the sand, the first war horn sounded. Long, deep, ancient, the Saracen cavalry surged forward in a thunderous wave. Dust rose like smoke. The ground quaked beneath pounding hooves. But at that exact moment, when every commander expected the Vikings to brace for impact, something happened that defied every rule of conventional warfare. The Vikings split apart. What looked like a disciplined battle line dissolved into 8 separate circular formations, positioned at precise angles to one another, forming lethal corridors of movement between them. To the cavalry charging forward, the battlefield suddenly became a maze, a trap designed not to withstand their momentum but to consume it from within. This was not chaos. It was calculated death. And the desert was about to learn that faith, when sharpened to a point, cuts deeper than steel. When the Saracen cavalry thundered into the Viking formation, what they expected to see was panic, confusion, and fractured discipline. But instead, they found themselves being drawn into a pattern so precise and so deliberately orchestrated that it felt less like a battlefield and more like a ritual. The Vikings had divided into 8 interlocking circles, each one a fortress of shields that could flex and rotate as if every man inside shared a single thought. The cavalry charged into what they believed were openings, only to find themselves suddenly sealed off, trapped inside pockets of death where axes came down in sweeping arcs that tore riders from their saddles, where spears with hooked tips latched onto armor and yanked men to the ground so they could be finished at arm's reach. The Saracen riders, trained to flow like wind and strike with speed, suddenly found their greatest advantage turned into a prison that suffocated them. The first wave fell into disarray. Horses screamed as they collided with shields or stumbled over bodies piling rapidly beneath their hooves. Riders slashed wildly, but every blow was met with a shield edge or a locking formation that absorbed impact like stone absorbs waves. The Vikings did not fight as individual warriors, they fought as a single organism, each movement reinforcing the next, each strike timed to open new angles of attack. The Saracen cavalry had never seen such unity from men they believed to be mere northern barbarians. And beneath that shock was something even more terrifying, the expressions on Viking faces. They did not look strained, desperate, or fearful. They looked exalted, as if the battlefield itself was a holy altar, and they were priests performing the final rite. Abu Nasr, watching from his vantage point on a nearby ridge, realized that this was no ordinary army. But he believed numbers would still prevail. He signaled for the mounted archers to advance. Arrows began to fall in dense waves, the air filling with the hiss of countless steel tips descending toward the Viking circles. Yet even here, the Vikings had expected exactly this. During the night before the battle, they had torn apart abandoned carts, siege shields, and whatever debris they could find. They had constructed makeshift portable ramparts, low shield walls reinforced with wood and leather, perfectly angled to deflect arrows. When the storm of missiles fell, the Vikings lowered themselves behind these walls, shields interlocked, bodies grounded. The arrows struck in a ceaseless, rattling cascade, but very few found flesh. The Saracens expected the Vikings to break formation under the barrage, but instead the defensive circles only seemed to tighten, becoming not weakened fortresses, but fortified wombs of silence and stillness in the middle of chaos. Then, when the arrows began to slow and the archers prepared to reposition, Magnus gave a signal that would haunt the memories of survivors for the rest of their lives. The Vikings rose as one, and from within each circle, warriors pulled out clay jars sealed with wax and marked with Byzantine glyphs. The Saracens did not understand what they were seeing until the first jar shattered, and then the desert erupted into fire. This was not the familiar flame of torches or burning oil. This was Greek fire, a substance that clung to armor, to cloth, to skin, feeding on air and heat, growing into roaring columns of flame that turned men into burning effigies. The desert wind fanned the inferno, spreading walls of fire between the Viking formations and the advancing infantry. The battlefield did not simply blaze, it screamed. Horses reared and bucked, men tore at their armor in futile attempts to escape the fire that clung like a living parasite, and formations that had marched with perfect unity dissolved into chaos, panic, and blind retreat. The Vikings did not stay behind their defenses. They advanced through the fire. Some of them were burning themselves, their cloaks and hair glowing like embers, but they continued forward with the same unbroken rhythm, driven by a conviction that death in this moment was not loss but ascension. They emerged from flame-like figures made of myth, silhouettes of holy terror, chanting prayers in Old Norse that echoed across the battlefield like the voices of the dead. And in that moment, the Saracens realized the true horror they were facing. Not men, not soldiers, not a foreign army, but warriors who welcomed death more than life. This was no longer a battle. It was a revelation of fanatic faith, and the desert had begun to tremble beneath it, as the battlefield drowned in fire and screams. Abu Nasr realized that the situation was no longer contained within the boundaries of strategy or command. His cavalry had fractured, his archers had lost synchronization, and the desert infantry that once moved like waves was now breaking apart into desperate, disjointed currents. Yet still, he believed one force remained capable of restoring order. His personal guard, 2,000 elite warriors hardened by campaigns across Damascus, Antioch, and the valleys of the Levant. These men had never known defeat. They had fought crusaders, nomads, Byzantines, even internal rebellions, and emerged unbroken every time. If any soldiers could crush the Viking core, it was them. So Abu Nasr summoned them, and, like a dark tide rolling toward the eye of a storm, they entered the battlefield. The Vikings saw them coming, armored riders in perfect formation, draped in colors that symbolized divine authority, carrying blades forged for duels of honor. But to the Vikings, this was the moment they had waited for. The battle until now had been preparation, a test, a shaping of the battlefield into the final stage of martyrdom. Magnus Barefoot stepped forward, towering above his men, his cloak scorched at the edges, his armor streaked with blackened ash and blood. His double-headed axe gleamed with the reflection of the surrounding fire, like a weapon carved from the wrath of heaven itself. His warriors closed ranks behind him, forming a spear point of human fury aimed directly at the heart of the Saracen elite. The two forces collided with such force that the ground itself seemed to shudder. Steel crashed against steel, shields splintered under the weight of impact, and the air was filled with the guttural roars of men who had abandoned fear. The Saracen guard fought with precision and discipline, striking where opening appeared, rallying around their banners, and moving as one practiced wave. But the Vikings fought with certainty, a certainty that death was not defeat, that pain was not suffering, and that every enemy slain delivered them closer to eternal reward. Their movements were not refined or elegant, they were relentless, overwhelming, and absolute. They did not give ground, did not hesitate, did not pause. To hesitate was to deny God. To strike was to serve him. At the center of this storm, Magnus and Abu Nasr met in single combat. Abu Nasr was no stranger to duels. He had trained since youth in the schools of Damascus, learning the art of the blade as both weapon and philosophy. His swordplay was fluid, refined, precise, each strike a lesson in discipline. But Magnus was the embodiment of a different doctrine, the doctrine of unstoppable force, of belief so intense it refused the existence of defeat. Their weapons clashed again and again, sparks bursting in the smoky air, the sound ringing like iron bells of judgment. Abu Nasr's technique was flawless, but technique could not shatter conviction, and conviction was the core of Magnus's existence. When Magnus's axe finally found the mark, it did not merely end a life, it broke an army. The moment Abu Nasr fell, his guard faltered, and in that single hesitation, the psychological weight of the impossible came crashing down upon the remaining soldiers. The Saracen army did not retreat, it collapsed. 40,000 warriors broke into chaos, scattering across the desert in a panic so violent that men trampled their own comrades as they fled. The Vikings pursued them not as soldiers, but as instruments of divine judgment, hunting for 3 days until the sands ran red. Only a few survived to speak of what they saw, and those who survived did not speak of Vikings as men. They spoke of spirits, of demons, of warriors who had already died before the battle began. This battle reshaped the Holy Land, it reshaped Europe. It reshaped history's understanding of faith, fear, and the terrifying power of belief. For centuries afterward, the memory of 800 northern warriors haunted both Christian and Muslim lands alike. Some called them heroes, others called them monsters. But everyone remembered them, because they proved that numbers do not win wars. Conviction does. History does not belong to the many. It is written by the few who refuse to kneel. If this story shook you, stay with us. There are more truths buried beneath the dust of time, waiting to be uncovered. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and remember, legends don't die, they echo.